Yeah. Are you my co-host today? Huh? You my co-host? Bribery is key. Awesome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Carolyn Knight. I am with the Santa Clara Valley Audubon Society, and today in Birding Basics, we are going to be talking about lists. All of those things that our birder friends obsess about that you as a birder are going to find completely taking over your life whenever you go outside. What they are, why they're important, why we care about lists, and how you can make your lists work for you, not just to keep track of what you're seeing, but to help you become a better birder. So, we're going to be starting out with the basics, as we always do. What is a list? Definitions are important, so we're starting out with the obvious. Now, a list is just that. You can think of it as something as simple as your grocery list, although of course our grocery lists are now far more complicated than they used to be. They're pretty much just a way of keeping track of what birds you're seeing and how many birds you're seeing. But with birding, they tend to get a little bit more in depth. So they're going to include the date and time, because while any time can be a good time to go birding, it will impact what sort of birds you're seeing, whether you're out and about and you're finding owls swooping around, or if you're taking in the dawn chorus. The date is particularly important because while birding isn't exactly a seasonal sport, you're not going to stop birding just because it's wintertime. It will impact what sorts of birds you're seeing. Many of us are living in areas, particularly if you're in the Bay Area, that are impacted by seasonal migrations. What birds are here depends entirely on whether you're birding in the springtime, whether you're birding in the fall. We've got gigantic seasonal migrations that come through and completely change what sorts of birds you're seeing. So they're also going to include some important information about what the conditions are like if you're birding on an overcast or a rainy day, or if it's completely sunny and warm out. That's going to impact not just your birding experience, but also how the birds are behaving. It's also going to include things like if you're birding with a group, how many people are in that group. The larger the group, sometimes that can impact how many birds are out and about and seeing, because they can get scared away by groups, by noise. And who you're birding with can also be helpful if you want to share your lists. So, the why of lists. Why bother with this practice? Why does it matter for birding? Why do birders care? There's a couple of reasons. The first is completely personal. When you're birding, you're putting a lot of effort into going out to find the birds, learning about them beforehand. So why wouldn't you want to do something to help yourself remember that? If you're writing it down, whether you are typing it up in a document on your computer that's saved away, if you're keeping a notebook, if you're using an app to track your birding, which many of us do, that will help you remember those sightings, whether it is a first of the season for you, whether it is a lifer, a bird you've never seen before, it's your first time identifying it. You'll have an easier time remembering the details, holding on to those feelings of excitement and joy that comes with identifying a bird for the very first time out in the field on your own. Those are going to be a lot easier to hold on to. And those happy memories can mean a lot. I've seen hundreds of cinnamon teal in my time as a birder, but I can still remember the very first one I ever identified back in my sophomore year of college at the Yolo Bypass Preserve. I've seen them hundreds of times since then. I still think they're gorgeous birds. They're really cool ducks, but that first sighting was just so impactful. And keeping a list can help keep that memory alive. But beyond that, you can use it to help keep track of your trips. If you're going afield for a bird, whether you're just going out of county to a state park or a preserve, if you're going out of state, you're going to Texas, you're going to Ohio, you're going to Hawaii, you're going to be seeing a lot of birds that aren't familiar to you. You're going to want to keep track of those new birds. Each one is a new experience, and you're going to probably be putting in some research in order to identify them successfully. And so you kind of want to commemorate that. Beyond that, there's a citizen science aspect to keeping lists. I talked about this last week in ethics, the importance of reporting and reporting with integrity. Many of our birders are reporting their lists. They're making their lists accessible to the public. And it's not just fellow birders who are using that to help themselves find those birds. It's also researchers who are trying to track things like population size, whether a species is present or absent in an area. It allows us to keep track of migrations, which are always changing, particularly in our current climate change issue, when our seasons are getting a little bit off kilter. We're seeing when our birds are migrating can shift a little bit. What that tells us, that's our canary in the coal mine, if you'll forgive the really obvious reference. And of course there's a competitive aspect to birding. I think I've mentioned it before, and lists really play into that. Birders keep track of the birds they've seen. We keep count. You'll hear the phrase life list used. That's the list of all of the birds that you've seen in your life. So if you're starting your listing practices, keeping track of the birds, keeping a record of the birds that you're seeing, compiling that life list is going to be a lot easier than if you start trying to do this a year into your birding experience. Then you don't have to backtrack and figure out, oh, did I really see that fox sparrow then? Or is it just now that I'm spotting it? And the when doesn't really matter quite so much as that you've spotted it, but it does make it a little bit easier to keep track of. And the competitive aspect of it, you may be familiar with the movie or the book, The Big Year. Obviously that's that competitive nature coming up to the forefront, kind of being exaggerated. Most birders aren't going to get quite that enthusiastic, shall we say, or go quite that overboard, but many of us will participate in the occasional big day. There's the worldwide big day coming up in May that Cornell is hosting, and that SCVAS is encouraging all of our members to take part in as part of our birdathon. It's going to be really fun. You just spend the whole day birding, trying to see as many birds as possible. And lists are vital for that. You can keep lists of your travels. You can keep lists of all of the birds you've seen in your county where you're living, all of the birds that you see within a year. And by having those lists, you can compare for each year, year to year, see how you're doing, see how your year is comparing to last year or the year prior to that. The majority of competition that comes from birding isn't competing against other people, because often we're interacting with other birders. We're sharing our sightings. We're talking about the best place to find a Selasphorus hummingbird, or which gulls are in the area right now, when are the ducks coming in for the winter. But you're competing against yourself. Birders are putting a ton of effort into learning how to identify birds, where to find birds, paying attention to things like behavior and habitat. And lists give us a way to quantify all of that effort in a way that's really satisfying. Now, how do we go about listing? Obviously, you can do the whole paper and pencil route. Certainly if you're in the field and you keep a notebook, that's definitely an option for you. There's nothing wrong with that. But I am going to point out that unless you've got a really effective and efficient and clear-cut filing system where you can cross-reference things like the dates you were birding, the locations you were birding, you're going to have a really hard time comparing these things, comparing locational birding from year to year or month to month. Unless you're really organized and disciplined about your record keeping, that's not something most of us can do easily. So how do most of our birders keep track of their lists, keep track of their sightings? There's a great app called eBird. Now this is something that is run through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's their program. It's a worldwide database of bird sightings that participants feed into. They post their lists, and then everyone has access to it. It is something that you need to make an account for, but it is free, and you can set your privacy settings so that your lists and your sightings aren't associated with your name, which is something that's helpful when you're first starting out and you're really unsure, and there's a lot of second guessing about every single identification. So that does take the pressure off, but it's a really good way to help you get involved in the community and the citizen science aspect that goes hand in hand with birding and birding ethically. So it's super easy to get started. It's a phone app as well as a website that you can access on your computer. It's available for Android and Apple, and as I said, it is free. So you make an account, there's no payment, you can fix up all of your privacy settings to the way you prefer them, and then it's really easy to get started. The first thing you do to open the app is you're going to see that page. It's got the date, it's got the time, it's got an option to record your track, and what that means is your phone will actually track the route you are taking while the app is active, while you're birding, so you've got an exact map of your route while you were walking around exploring an open space preserve or a local park. And then it's just a simple matter of clicking that bright green button to start your checklist. So it's really easy to use, it's super user-friendly and straightforward. When you're birding, it's going to have an entire list, and this is typically based on your location. So the common birds are going to be showing up. It's going to give you a little indicator when a bird is uncommon or rare, which can help you figure out your sightings if you're just starting out. If you're not sure if it's one species or another, you can take a look and pay attention to how common that bird is. And it's simply a matter of marking down how many of those birds you're seeing. Now, I realize when you're getting started birding, I did mention the second guessing, and there's part of that doesn't really go away. It happens with fewer species, but there's always going to be a moment where you're just like, well, I'm not entirely sure I got that. Maybe the bird moved too fast. Maybe it's a species that has a lot of shared features with other birds that you can find in that area. So there is a review process that goes in with every list. There are expert birders that watch these lists, like hawks, looking for discrepancies, birds that haven't been sighted in that area in a really long time, birds that just shouldn't be in that area. And of course, it's always possible that you get a vagrant, a bird that's flown off course in its migration, it just got lost, blown out of its way by a storm. These things do happen. And oftentimes, if you get a discrepancy like that, they'll reach out to you. It's not an accusation. It's done in a really friendly, professional manner, but they just want to be sure that the data that they're collecting that's available to everybody is accurate. Now, submitting your list, there's a review process. You go through your list again, you make sure you've got all of the numbers you can, and if, say for example, you're birding at the Palo Alto Baylands, and you see northern shovelers, and it's a really obvious duck, you know it's a northern shoveler, but there's no way in heck you're going to be counting all of those. There's a couple hundred out there. You don't feel comfortable giving an estimate for it. There's a little X marker that just means it was uncounted. It was present, it was there. Usually it's taken to imply either you saw the bird and then forgot to take a count, or there's just so many of them that you're just kind of like, okay, that's a lot. That's a lot there, and that's totally fine. You've got the location up at top. You can put in the number of observers, so if you're in a group, you can actually share lists with each other. So only one person has to be recording, and that's something that's incredibly helpful when you're out on, say for example, an Audubon walk. One person can be keeping track of the list while everybody else is on the lookout for those birds, and then the entire group has a compiled and shared list. And you can edit that list. If you, say for example, didn't see the tree swallow that got marked on the list, it flew overhead too fast for you to identify it, you don't feel comfortable saying you saw it, you can remove it from your list without ever touching the original list itself. So your records are accurate for you, everybody else has an accurate record, and you've got those sightings for your personal counts. So eBird is something I encourage all birders to use. If you don't feel like you can use it on your phone, whether it's something like data concerns or you just don't feel comfortable with using your smartphone, that's totally fine. You can always submit lists after the fact, whether it's on the app or on the website. It's another really great resource for finding birds, for finding birding hotspots. And it's a really cool way to just explore your area, figure out where the new birds are, to help you flesh out your life list or your year list. Try and get those first of the season birds for you that everybody gets really excited for. But I have promised that every week we are going to be learning about a new yard bird, and today I want to talk to you guys about a really dapper little fellow that we've all probably seen before, even if we weren't paying attention to him, and this is our dark-eyed junco. Look at him. He's adorable. So our dark-eyed juncos are sparrows, and they're going to be sparrow size, so it's a small bird. It's a little brown job. It's going to be hopping around on the ground, foraging under leaf matter, mostly for seeds, but also for insects as well. But you're going to be encountering these guys in parks and yards across the entire country, not just Santa Clara County. This is one of the most widely spread birds in the country. You can find them from coast to coast and everywhere in between. And they've got some interesting features because of that. So, some of the field marks that we should be paying attention to on this bird. So, we can see it's got a pale beak that stands out really, really well. It's a little bit more visible here. It's going to have a pale belly, but what I want to draw your guys' attention to is just to the edge of this tail. It's hidden when they're seated, or when they're standing, or they're perched, but the outer tail feathers, the outer rectrices of this little bird are bright white compared to the central tail feathers, which tend to be dark. And what this means is even if you can't get a good look at this bird because it is darting away, it is flying away from you as you're walking, it means it's going to flash you a really vibrant field mark that you can use to identify them, even if they're not sitting still. And that's that this tail is black and white striped. So it's got two thick white stripes framing its darker central tail feathers. And this is nice because oftentimes when we're talking about field marks, they tend to be something that, while it is helpful to identify the species, it may be something that you look at that and you think to yourself, well, I mean, how likely is it that I'm going to see that when that bird is flying away from me? But our dark-eyed juncos are very helpful in the fact that one of their field marks that's present across the country is visible when they're in motion, and in fact is more visible when they're in motion than when they're just on the ground or staying still. So, when we're in California also, it's going to be important to note that these guys have this full kind of executioner's hood that they're wearing. This dark hood makes that pale beak that I mentioned stand out really, really well. And the important thing to notice is that I did say when you're in California. So the two dark-eyed juncos that we're seeing in these pictures are what we call the Oregon coloration. And this coloration isn't going to be present in all of the dark-eyed juncos that are found across the country. These little guys, because they're so widespread, they're found across North America, have something called subspecies. And there's about 15 to 16 officially recognized subspecies that are genetically distinct from each other. But there's really only about, there's far fewer at least that you can parse out via field marks. One of the most common and widespread of these is the slate-colored dark-eyed junco. As you can see, it doesn't have that distinct dark hood, but we can still see those white outer tail feathers on the edge of its tail, and that pale beak, and of course the dark-eyed eye for which this junco's named. And you're going to find these if you are on the East Coast. It is our most common coloration, but we've also got really fun things like the pink-sided dark-eyed junco that's present as well. And there's also things like the red-backed junco, the white-winged dark-eyed junco. So this is a common bird that's going to change how it looks for you if you're traveling around. But as long as you're keeping track of where you are in the country, which subspecies is most common in there, and those subspecies are mentioned in field guides because it is important to notice, you're going to be able to keep track of these birds pretty easily. It may not always look like the dark-eyed junco that you're familiar with, but it is still that common bird. They're still going to behave the same way. They're going to be foraging on the ground. They're going to be building their nests hidden in brush on the ground itself. They're still going to be looking a little bit different, but it's the same bird, essentially, and they're still going to be behaving the same way. So that is our birding basics for the week. Thank you for joining me. I hope you guys are staying safe, staying sane in this, and staying inside, and I'll see you all next week. Have a great day.